This episode is sponsored by the Cedar City Business and Innovation Center, dedicated to supporting local businesses and entrepreneurs. It provides resources and services aimed at fostering business creation, growth, and retention. The center features the makerspace, where entrepreneurs and small businesses can have access to 3D printers, video production, and photography equipment, t-shirt printing, and more. Whether you're starting a new venture or looking to expand an existing one, the Cedar City Business and Innovation Center offers the tools and guidance to help you succeed. To learn more and get involved, visit innovationcenter.cc. Welcome to Explore Local Podcast, a weekly audio show presented by Visit Cedar City Bryan Head and Cedar City Iron County Economic Development, and produced by Dallas Smith Media. I'm David Johnson, and I'm hosting this show. And today we have a wonderful guest. We have Ryan Paul, who's a professor of history at Southern Utah University. And a lot of locals may know Ryan. They may see him around. And he has a great background that I think we want to dive a little bit into. But Ryan, to start, welcome. And why don't you just give us a high level of your involvement and kind of your background and why you're here in Cedar City and what are you doing?
First of all, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here and always tell a few good stories. So I'm from Northern Utah originally.
Okay.
Grew up in Northern Utah, went to Weber State University. And I always, when I was a kid, my mother was the director of the emergency department at McCady Hospital.
Oh, really?
So I always wanted to be an emergency department physician. I mean, that was my goal through high school, through my first little bit of college. And then
Natural segue into history.
Yeah. So, well, I struggled with, as all people do, except for the certainly blessed ones, I guess. Chemistry was always a problem for me. But I went and I did well, but I had to take a history class like everybody does. Mm-hmm. And I had an amazing history professor. It was the basic survey course. I think it was called History 17, or not, we call it 1700, like 700 or something like that.
Right.
And it really was a guy who just got up and told stories, and it really resonated with me. And then I went on my LDS mission and had some experiences that were really thoughtful about the storytelling nature of things. And so when I came back, I had a couple other experiences that we can talk about if you want that solidified that. But I realized that what greater job could it be than telling stories about lives? I remember very distinctly watching there's a very old Ken Burns film that in his early days, he did a film on the Brooklyn Bridge. And I was like, late night, you couldn't sleep, watch it, on KUED. And I remember very vividly, there was a picture of the dedication of the Brooklyn Bridge, like a still life, right? Mm-hmm. And you know how Ken Burns, moves in and pans out and all kinds of stuff. And so I really had this moment where I thought, once that flashbulb went off, all those people went home, right? They had people that loved them. They had people that hated them. They had desires. They wanted to take care of their families. All of those individuals in the photo had stories. And I really just thought, what greater way to spend a life than collecting and telling the stories of people. And so I changed my major. I gave up the medical world, probably thankfully for many, many people, and then went into history and had a experience where I really wanted to study. I don't know if you've ever had this experience, but generally where you are, you think, I don't want to do that. I want to do something else.
Yeah,
so I wanted to study Southern,
greener.
Right.
Yeah.
And I wanted to study Southern history, specifically rock and roll, right? The culture of rock and roll and how it develops. And so I went to the University of Mississippi, Ole Miss, because the Center for Southern Culture was there.
Yeah.
And did my work on the development of rock and roll in the Mid-South. I wrote a big thing about Elvis and Johnny Cash and Carl Perkins.
You and I are going to be two peas in a pod. I love
and how
that.
all that stuff came about in Southern culture.
Right.
But when I got there, my years at Ole Miss, what my cohort wanted me to do was to talk about Native Americans and cowboys and mountain men. They wanted to me, because I was from Utah, to be a historian of the West. Huh. And it was just a very interesting thing how geography kind of defines you. Mm-hmm. You know, I mean, I call it the power of place, and that'll come back, I'm sure, in our conversation. But I remember, you know, there's no more arrogant people in the world than history graduate students. And I was in a seminar where you just talk about stuff, and it was a seminar on the Civil War. And we were in a big conference room, and there was only maybe 15 students, but I was at the end of the table. I had a friend from South Carolina, a friend from Philadelphia, or from Pennsylvania, and they were arguing about some esoteric point. And I mentioned something about, well, what about this? And they both looked at me almost at the same time and said, well, what do you know? You're from Utah. Like me in the West would have no understanding of the Civil War.
Right.
And I said, you know what? You're right. My people wanted both your people dead. And it really came to this idea of how geography defines who we are, how the things that we grow up with, oftentimes we come back to, even though we want to, eschew those. And I still do rock and roll and things, but Southern history isn't my focus anymore. And I made a decision in graduate school that I wanted to move to public history, which is museums and archives. And so when I got out of grad school, I spent my first part of my career as a curator. I ended up getting a job here at Frontier Homestead State Park, a large, state park museum.
Right.
And in fact, growing up in northern Utah, I had never even thought about Cedar City. Like I never had once been here, or even I'd never been to the Shakespeare Festival. I'd never been to Cedar Breaks, anything like that. But this was where the job was. And so I came and took that job, and have since never had a desire to go anywhere else. Right. And with that job as a curator, I became the president of the Utah Museums Association for many years. So I traveled the state talking about museums and interpretation and state history, all the while teaching at the university, and then eventually just decided that I wanted to do some teaching more than just museum work. And so I funneled into there. So that's the long, you asked for a dime, I gave you a quarter, but that's kind of where I am at and how I ended up.
Well, someone that loves storytelling, I wouldn't expect anything less. And that's really, I think, part of the purpose of this podcast is let's tell these stories of what's going on in Cedar City between our history and our present, and what lies ahead in our future. And that's, hence the name Explore Local. We kind of want to dive in, and we want to explore what we have going on here. And so tell me, now that you're here in Cedar City, or you've been here, how many years you've been here now?
Over 20, 22, 23 years. Maybe.
Okay, great.
Raised my kids here. And it's been a while.
Nice. So with that, you've obviously had the opportunity to, as a history buff, learn the area, get to know. So what are some of your, and we can dive into a couple of those, but high level, what are some of the niches that you really love and are passionate about here in Cedar City, Iron County area, and the history?
So I think that the niches that I think are interesting in my career, the way I ended up doing what I do, is that I came here to Cedar City, and one person that really kind of took me under her wing was Janet Segmiller, who was at the time the special collections director at SUU, and she had written the Centennial History of Iron County.
Okay.
And she saw me as a person who she could, I think, tutor a little bit. And so under her tutelage, I learned more of the local history, which was needed for that particular kind of park. It's the museum that I was in, stuff that I wasn't familiar with. I understood broad concepts, but the finer brushstrokes were a little bit foreign to me. And what that led me to, working with her over 2 decades, is a discussion of the Utah Parks Company and this area's role in the development of tourism in the American West, which led to a long time, almost 10-year project between the museum and the university, doing oral histories and photo documentaries of these people that worked for the Utah Parks Company. And the Utah Parks Company was the organization led by Union Pacific that ran all of the concessions at Cedar Breaks, Zion, Bryce, and the North Rim of the Grand Canyon. Part of this larger railroad national parks conglomeration.
Right.
Well, as all that was going on, Ken Burns was doing his national parks documentary, and they knew, I don't know
what year was this?
It was I don't know what year that came out, or 2000s, maybe late 90s. I'm not sure off the top of my head, but it had been the 2000s because I was working at the state park, and they somehow found out that we were doing work on this area that I was. And so they contacted me and said, hey, can you work with us? And so I sent some stuff. It all ended up on the cutting room floor, which is not a problem. But ultimately there was a tour group, it's called Talc Tours. They're still around. They do high-end tours, like for fairly not upper class, well-to-do people.
Yeah.
I mean, it's one of those things, and rightly so. And they had partnered with Ken Burns to do tours based on his films. So, for example, they would do a Civil War battlefield tour, and they did one tied into national parks that was the parks of the Southwest. I mean, it was like, you would pay some money and end up driving only like 300 miles because they did flights over, natural bridges. And I mean, it was pretty high end stuff, but at the time, part of that was bringing in speakers. And so, the Ken Burns and Dayton Duncan had said, well, we know this guy in Cedar City who could maybe do something at Zion. So I ended up going down, doing this long time for almost 10 years, presentation on the Parks Company multiple times in a summer. And with that, there was another guy on the day after me. His name was Alfred Runty, who was kind of the dean of national parks historians. Like he's the guy in the 80s that writes the book on the history of the national parks. It's a seminal work. Was a consultant on Ken Burns's film. They were friends. He's in the film a lot. And so over that decade, he became kind of a mentor to me, which led me doing more environmental history, railroad history, that kind of stuff. And it led to some other partnerships and things that have been really, really positive for me, and I think for the university. So I think what I'm saying is that my niche now is public and local history, environmental and the history of the national parks, as well as what I'm really fascinated by is how culture impacts us. Right. So I do classes on rock and roll, and I do work on the Shakespeare Festival, how these experiences of us publicly sharing things with each other, experiences define who we are as a people, as a culture, and as a country.
Oh, that's awesome. You know what? That's actually a perfect segue to a couple areas that I really wanted to dive into. So, part of my role in economic development for Cedar City and Iron County is recruiting businesses. And one of the opportunities that we have here that really isn't the same anywhere else in Southern Utah is we have that Union Pacific Rail, which is recently in the last year opened the door to transload facilities. And for those that don't know what transload is, that's, you bring things on rail, you transload it onto a truck and you truck it that last mile. So instead of, having trucks come in from LA and having to go through all their customs and everything that in California law, we can just have it railed straight here from the ships and then trucked. But my point in bringing that up, we're starting to see some great momentum with the rail that has kind of sat stale for a long time. And so thinking about that, I want to jump clear back to what you were referring to. Union Pacific Railroad, when they first came here, I mean, that's how people came and got to the parks. Union Pacific Railroad dubbed Cedar City, Iron County, gateway to the parks, right? Mm-hmm. So I would love for our audience to hear a little bit more about that. Like, how did that come to be? What are some cool things that people might not know of how significant the rail coming here was and how significant having those national parks were to not only the West, but in particular Utah's economy and our local economy here?
So certainly think that the rail, the train coming to Cedar City is revolutionary. And it's not something that had been all of a sudden someone had an idea to do it, right? So as you know, the Transcontinental Railroad connects up at Promontory Point in 1869, and Brigham Young is very adamant that, well, first of all, he thought he wanted them to connect, the Salt Lake should be the hub, but it became very clear that wasn't going to happen. I don't know if you're familiar with the Corinne, which was considered the Gentile capital of Utah. So Brigham Young was very adamant that not be where this kind of connection happens. Uh-huh. So he uses a lot of the LDS Church's funds and labor to get the railroad to shift a little bit and bypass Corinne and end up in Ogden, which is why Ogden becomes kind of Junction City and it develops that way. But once that happens, He then uses a lot of funds from the church to invest in a north-south railroad, primarily up to, in Idaho and then down into the thought was it was going to go all the way to Las Vegas and then to California and through southern Utah. They get as far as Milford, about as far as that they develop over time as we compress years. And then from Milford, they just head through Nevada and into California.
Interesting.
So the Los Angeles Salt Lake Railroad exists for quite a while. There's always a discussion, if you look at the old Iron County Record articles, about maybe this is the year they're going to keep coming south and through Cedar City. And what really changes that is the iron, right? So Cedar City, of course, is founded by Mormon pioneers who were there to mine iron to create this kind of self-sufficiency in the frontier West. It doesn't go well. It doesn't last long because for a variety of reasons. And while iron continues to be processed and mined in the county for a while, you can only sell skillets and andirons to farmers for so long, right? And it's just logistically difficult to get things out. And
especially back then.
Yeah, especially back then. And in fact, at one point at Old Irontown, they had bought some rail and some train track and tried to get a little railroad going, but it wasn't happening. But in the 1920s, with this economic boom that comes after World War I, there is a need for that. I mean, we still have west of us here the second largest deposit of iron ore in the country.
Yeah, I mean, we have Utah Iron here locally, and they sell internationally.
Yeah. So with this idea of iron becoming critical, that's a big push to move a spur into Iron Springs. From the railroad, like the junction was at Lund, which is about 10 miles west of us here, maybe. And at Lund at one time, they had a very nice depot designed by a very famous architect. And that was where, when you caught the railroad, you took a coach or a wagon or whatever out to Lund, and that's where everything was picked up.
Gotcha.
Even when they're building the university. So
they were transloading by horse and buggy.
Absolutely, they were transloading. Sorry, we have a. That's a great point. We have a huge history of transloading.
Interesting.
Right here. So people and goods and everything else. I mean, even the boiler for Old Main was brought in that way.
Interesting.
So the push was, let's do iron. Let's think about an easier way to move iron in. Now, at the same time, there has been a big push by the railroads to develop national parks. So, Yellowstone's in the 1860s, Yosemite's a little bit before that. Railroads see those as vehicles to drive rail traffic. Right. And that's nothing new, right? I mean, Coney Island is developed because the New York Railroad says, let's put something as far out as we can. So the only way to get there is to take our trains during the weekend when ridership is down. Yeah. So this is nothing new for railroads. And so Yellowstone and others, Union Pacific has been doing that. The residents of Cedar City have been thinking really hard about the iron on their cliffs that are rusting, right? The red rock and everything else. So they have worked to develop some kind of tourism economy. In fact, before Union Pacific, we had the Perry brothers who would go out to Lund and pick people up and take them down into these new national monuments.
I'm glad you brought that up because I do want to dive into the Perry brothers a little bit here.
Which will become Zion and all that other kind of stuff. So that work is already happening. UP had already done stuff like that at Yellowstone and had been very successful in that. The 1915 Pan American Exposition, they had actually rebuilt Yellowstone in a mile-long diorama with an exploding Old Faithful that you could walk around. And other railroads had done things at the South Rim and other places. So they were already looking in ways to develop that. So it's this combination. And again, 1923, end of World War I. World War I is over in 1918. The American economy is booming. The automobile is now taking off. Right. So tourism is a big deal. But remember, it's not until 1916 that the Park Service is even formed, right? So it's relatively new. It's not even 10 years old when they start working here. So they don't have any money to invest in infrastructure at the parks. The railroads do. Right. So what our enterprising forefathers and mothers of Cedar City do is they say, look, we've got iron, we've got access to people, And so Union Pacific agrees. They bring the guy down. He looks it over and they love it. And so they finally build a spur from Lund into Cedar City.
Gotcha.
So the train can come in. They build a depot. They build a big hotel on Main Street. And that opens up southern Utah, right? I mean, so it's not just tourists and miners, but Hollywood comes because of the train.
Right.
I mean, it just changes everything.
Right. So that's another good segue. So you mentioned Hollywood comes. So let's talk about the Perry brothers. When people think filming Utah, they generally think Kanab, right? Because they really made a long history of filmmaking down in Kanab. But what most people don't know is it actually started with the Perry brothers right here in Cedar City. So tell us a little bit about how that came to fruition.
So Gronway Perry was born in Salt Lake, and he is kind of a master of all trades. He ends up studying agriculture. He comes down to Cedar City to work at the BAC, which will become SUU, as a teacher.
What did BAC stand for?
Branch Agricultural College.
Oh, okay.
Actually, we don't have to dive into that, but it was BNS, which was a normal school for teachers.
Oh,
and then it turned into an agricultural school. So he comes down to teach here and falls in love with the place, right? And I learned from someone older than me years ago that if you like where you are, you find reasons to stay, not reasons to go.
Right.
And Gronway Perry was one of these guys who found reasons to stay. He became involved in all kinds of things. It's business or politics or teaching. And so he ended up going to World War I, but he had a reaction to a vaccine that wouldn't let him travel. And so he ended up taking care of horses for the Army, which became a big love of his. And he really began thinking about horse-drawn vehicles and the preservation of his past, which was important to him. So he just stayed here and created businesses and things to stay. He ran for mayor. But anyway, as a younger guy, he brought his brothers, specifically his brother Chauncey, down. And they're the ones that, at the time, Gronway's managing the Cedars Hotel, which is still on Main Street. It's not a hotel anymore, but that building is still there. And he is there when a survey crew who's there surveying what will become Zion and some Cedar Breaks is there talking. And he gets this idea about maybe we should find ways to take people there. Right. And this is in the early 1920-ish. And so
like a local guide.
Yeah, like a local guide. And so he works with the Salt Lake Los Angeles Railroad to get this little company going, the Utah Parks Transportation Company, gets his brother Chauncey to come and help. He has another younger brother, Whit, and he begins this concession. Which is one reason why Union Pacific is even more interested is because they already have a transportation concession in place.
Yeah.
And then they get another guy who has been very successful in Yellowstone, William Wiley, to do the tent camp. So there's some infrastructure already here by the time the railroad comes. So Gronway Perry is the guy that gets his brother to come down and make that happen. As that begins to take off, his brother Chauncey had trained as a pilot in World War I, never flew in combat, but knew how to fly, loved to fly. And what they do is they begin thinking about ways to stay and not to go. And they see the early days of the movies and Hollywood Westerns that are obviously filmed on back lots and everything else. And they see the country in which we live here in the Southwest and think, well, wouldn't it be cool if we started filming here?
Right.
And so they knew they needed to get movie companies to think about logistics, and they could help with that.
Right.
So Chauncey flies over this area with a movie camera, taking pictures. Gronway, while he had been in the Army and taking care of horses, had learned to play polo and loved it, and became connected with Will Rogers, who was a very famous American of the day. And so using their skills and their connections, they begin to get Hollywood to say, hey, here's this area. Why not film movies here? Now the train comes to Cedar City, so you can come to Cedar City. We will then take you to these locations and we'll feed you. We'll take care of all the catering. We've got extras. We've got horses. So all of this stuff you won't need to get, and you'll be filming in these amazing locations.
Right.
And so they agree. And so in 1923 and 1924, a movie company comes out. Tom Mix, who was the great movie cowboy of the day, films the first movie ever filmed in Utah called Deadwood Coach.
Yeah.
And it's filmed partly in Cedar City, but it's mostly filmed in Zion. And and Cedar City is the gateway there.
Yeah.
Right. That Tom Mix comes into Cedar City, great celebrations, parades, all kinds of stuff to make that happen. And he goes and he promises that he and his movie cowboys will come to the Iron County Rodeo. Okay. But as it turns out, the weather is so great that they get done early. And the movie company, I think it might be Fox, 20th Century Fox, or I may be off there, but they say, well, we're not going to pay you just to stay in Southern Utah for another week. So he has to go. And he writes this big apologetic letter about how he's a man of his word, but he's also had signed a contract and everything else. So Deadwood Coach is the film that opens movie making in Utah.
And it's black and white?
It is, silent? And it no longer exists. It no longer exists.
Not in the public domain or anything?
No, it burned away. All the copies were gone, first of all, but then the only copies that were left, one of the big movie studios had a big fire and burned a lot of their films, and Deadwood Coach is one of those. Oh, wow. So there's a great historian named James Dark who wrote a book on Hollywood in Utah in general and has looked and looked and looked, but that film is gone. It is a lost film. So we have reviews of it. We have still images and marketing of it, and we have newspaper clippings. I was going to say,
I thought I've seen some things.
So they're like title cards, and so we have some images of the film. We have some pictures of Tom Mix in Utah, lots of newspaper reports about it. But that's it. There's no copy of that film in existence.
You know, I didn't know about the Will Rogers connection. That is such a interesting connection through playing polo. And it just makes me think of how valuable having connections are to connect with the right people to make things possible. Whether it's in Iron County or whether it's for somebody's business or whatever the case is, that's just so interesting. All these little pieces that come together. And I love how you talked about how the Perry brothers had already thought about the logistics that Hollywood might go, we can't do it because we need horses. We've got to travel, we've got to ship all these things. Where are we going to get the extras? They thought through some of those logistics and said, hey, we want this here. We need to think what their needs are going to be and where they're going to say no, right? And a lot of times concepts for business or events or things, people say, oh, they should just bring it here because it's great here. Cedar City is wonderful, and it is. But they clearly thought out a path to make it possible, to make it as easy as possible to get here. And in my role, that's a lot of what I do when we're trying to bring businesses and site selectors here is how do we make it as easy and as palatable as possible to come here. And I just love the savvy nature that the Perry brothers have. And I love how you're talking about loving it here. So finding reasons to stay here, right? And so with the Perry brothers, then, and you'll have to correct me or help me make this tie, but I understand that kind of that was a little bit of momentum of eventually a theater on Main Street in Cedar City. Did that bringing movies here play a role into opening that theater, or was that already kind of a natural segue of what was going on?
Yeah, that's a great question. That was a natural segue, and it's interesting that you bring that up because I think that one thing we think about, and we don't like to think about this, but that art, whether it's theater or filmmaking or whatever, is a business, right? I mean, that's what the Perry brothers understood, is that it's also makingly not palatable, but also economically efficient.
Yeah,
right. So if you don't sell tickets, it doesn't exist, right? We forget about the economic component of art. I mean, I'm certainly art for art's sake, and art makes us better people and humans and all that stuff. I totally agree. But it's the sad fact that there's an economic component to that as well. Right. And the Perry brothers understood that, right? So there were theaters in Cedar before this. The very first theater was called the Gem Photo Play, and it was, it was silent. That we had magic lantern shows all the time, people playing the piano. Randall Jones, who is the great booster of Cedar City, would take the Jones photography legacy. The theater, the Randall Jones Theater is named after him.
Okay, yeah.
He would take magic lantern shows all over the West and entice people to come here. What he'd say, to come visit God's gardens, is what he called
great.
this. So he was a huge booster of this area. So one of the things that I really want to bring out is that in this early days, there were lots of people in the community who were absolutely on board with bringing tourists and as many people here as we can. They saw that, after the Mountain Meadows massacre, the population of Cedar goes from 1,000 to 300, right? And so this small community surviving by raising sheep and cattle. The college helps a little bit, but it's not a big driver of employment, right? Or economic people coming to Cedar City. And what people find is that their kids get older and they have to move somewhere else to survive. So they found ways to get economic incentives, economic power in this community by providing tourism, mining, movies. All of those things were designed to build the future of this community. And overall, the community has always been very supportive of that. This changes a little bit sometimes in some communities in today's world, but we were all behind these cultural and tourist organizations to happen. But so the Gem Photoplay was there. There was another theater that opened very early called the Thorley that was right about where the Cedar Theater is, if you think about where Main Street is. And the Thorley had a barbershop in the front, and you walked in kind of a curtained area, like a hallway down the back, and then you saw there's where the movie was. And again, these were silent films, oftentimes with piano accompaniment until we get sound mirroring together. Right. And then eventually the barbershop leaves and the Thorley begins this series of theater names. It's been the Avalon and a couple others. But it finally settles on the Cedar Theater where it is today. And it becomes really an important part of the community, right? This in this small town, like other small towns, it was our movie palace.
Right.
And then we have and then on the other side of the street, the same family built another theater called the Parks.
Oh, okay.
And the Parks is long gone.
Right across the street?
No, it was further down. It's
gotcha.
It was kind of where the like you turn in the parking lot for like Great Harvest.
Oh, okay.
And the Mexican restaurant that's right there. So it was so those two theaters existed in Cedar City.
Interesting.
So movies were a big part of this, right? So it wasn't that movies were foreign to people in Cedar City. They've had them all along, but to have actual movie stars come here.
Yeah.
Right? And it's important to note that, Cedar City's bigger than St. George. This is where they're staying. And that's why Kanab becomes important, is because the Perry brothers realize they could do more if they had more resources in Kanab. Gotcha. So they build the Perry, because that's closer to where the sites are.
Right.
So they build the Perry Lodge, which is still in existence.
Right.
And they get their brother Whit to come down and run the Perry Lodge. And he creates this almost mini little Hollywood for all these movie stars to come and stay, which is why Kanab then grows, really because of the Perry brothers as well.
Right. That's interesting. So, one thing I really like is if you look at our historic downtown right now, the Cedar Theater right now is Ganoshed Brownies, which, by the way, if anybody hasn't gone there, they have incredible brownies and ice cream. And what they've done is they've actually taken the back of that theater and now turned it into a venue, an event center for people to gather. And I always really admire individuals that that are entrepreneurial and come in, especially some of these older historic buildings, and say, what can we do with this? And how can we bring some synergy? And what I see some of the business owners in the historic downtown doing, just to me, is very reminiscent of kind of what you were describing with the Perry brothers. How can we make this work? We love it here. And it is a balance. It's a balance between doing what you love as a business. I mean, that's the grand old story of small business, right? Is I'm a really good baker, or I'm a really good mechanic, or I'm really good at this. But then they also have to learn the financial side and managing business and managing employees and those different things. And I don't know if in some of those early days, if you know stories about some of those early entrepreneurs and maybe some of the hurdles they had to go through, especially in historic downtown. There had been a fire that had occurred and burned portions of the historic downtown, and they've had to revitalize since. And I know I'm kind of grasping at straws because I don't know what your vault of knowledge is, but I'm curious if you have any good stories kind of about our historic downtown that come to mind.
Well, I think there's a lot, but I think that it's important to note that for a long time, historic downtown was the center of the community. Right,
Mm-hmm.
This is where you went to shop. This is where you went to recreate. This is where you went to worship. All of those things. This is where you went to vote, to have government business, to mail your letters. So everything was geared towards moving stuff to downtown. And of course that expands as we come by, but you build the train depot, the park is downtown,
Mm-hmm.
the library was downtown, the tabernacle, the church was downtown. So it really was this community focus to keep this place. This is where you went. And then everything else moved around that. And partly because, we were a primarily agrarian people. And so you needed bigger lots to have your little homestead on and those kinds of things. We did have bigger community sheep herds and orchards and things that people could access. But that changes once we start focusing less on farming and more on providing needs for tourists or whatever it is as we grow up as a community. And so downtown, its goal changes. And today, you've got the Providence Center on one end, and you've got the other stuff happening at the north and to the west of us. So downtown becomes this centerpiece of doing this. And what happens as the community grows, as the university comes online and other people are coming in from bigger cities, realizing what needs to happen for growth. Right. So there's basic infrastructure like roads and water and that irrigation and that kind of thing. But even when you think of things like banking, right, we didn't have a bank. A lot of this was done by barter. We had lots of co-ops where you would get shares based upon that, and you'd use that to bring in goods from other places. But it was very clear by the mid-19 or by 1910, 1914 that if Cedar City wanted to grow, it needed to think about economics in a different way. Yeah, needed to think about banking, because there's a great story that that William R. Palmer, who was a longtime resident and historian, when he was going on his LDS mission, what people gave him instead of money were trade coupons for the local co-op. Right. So instead of, it would be like, instead of giving someone money to buy suit, you'd give them an IOU for some money at Cardin's.
And that's such a foreign concept nowadays. Right. My father-in-law has been a small business owner for years. And I remember there was this little co-op where they did bartering and things like that. And I never heard of that before. And to think that, especially here in Cedar City, people without a bank, I didn't realize there wasn't a bank where they're bartering to meet their needs and make their living and things. And so
very cash poor.
Yeah.
Right? Very cash poor.
Interesting.
Because it didn't, but Nathan Porter, who at the time was the president of the school, says, look, if we want to grow, we're going to need a bank. And so it's him and a bunch of other community members that kind of pool funds and get together with the legal stuff to create the Bank of Southern Utah, not State Bank, but the Bank of Southern Utah.
And where was that first located?
It was across the street from where it is now, a little bit across the street and a little bit north of there. And then it moved to the building that's right directly north of where it is now as well. I don't know. It used to be Mountain West Books. I think now it's maybe a Levitt Business Center or something like that. So they began this and began thinking about how to do this. They were very worried that they wouldn't have enough cash for change and everything else. But really, after the first year of that bank being in operation, sales grew by 25%.
Now, isn't there some story of how they wouldn't come unless the locals raised like $100,000 or something to that effect?
So what happens is the bank by the 1930s. So it's been in business about 20 years. They had moved to the building that is now used to be Wells Fargo, but I don't know what it is now. But it's the kind of got the Doric columns there on Main Street. Very, very non-Mormon pioneer architecture looking. But it still says Bank of Southern Utah at the top. So they moved into that building. It had been really this is the bank, right, that everyone banked at. And there was a law that said that you had to have you have to have enough money to cover all of the deposits of your depositors.
Oh, okay.
Right. And so by a certain date.
And this is years after.
Yeah, this is right during
the Depression.
Right? So it's 20 years later. So what happens is generally that's not a problem because taxes are due in November. And so the tax revenues come to the bank and they can cover those depositors. So the bank was depending on that to happen. And what had happened was because of the effects of the Depression, the county commission had said, we're going to delay taxes being due. Oh. So the bank never got the money that they expected to come in. And so they were not, it's very, very important for some to say that they were not unsolvent, right? They didn't run out of money. It just hadn't got in there yet.
Right.
And so they made a very difficult decision on Christmas Eve in the 1930s to say, we don't have the money to cover this. We're going to have to close the bank.
It's like Jimmy Stewart in It's a Wonderful Life.
Yeah. So they closed the savings and loan, right? The Bedford Falls Savings and Loan. So they closed the bank and the doctor of Cedar City comes home and he takes his hand, he puts his hand in his pocket and gathers his family around the table and he has a handful of change and he slaps on the table and says, this is all we have. This is all we got. So the community is very adamant that this bank not fail. So they go to the bank board in Salt Lake and say, we want to reopen the bank. And the bank says, well, they say, we know you have some money, but not enough. So if you can raise $100,000 in the middle of the Depression, we will let you, okay, you're reopening. So during the middle of the Depression, they try to do bake sales. Teachers go without pay for a month to donate that to the bank fund. Kids are throwing in, nickels and dimes and pennies to make that work. People are mortgaging their homes. They're calling in life insurance policies. The same thing they did, almost 100 years earlier, 50, 80 years earlier when the university was in trouble, right? About, back up the mountain, that story. So they do this. They can't raise the 100,000. They raise about 90,000 or so and go to the bank and say, hey, in Salt Lake, we can't get 100, but we've got 90.
We're close.
Right. We're close. And the bank board says, okay, but you know what's going to happen. The moment you open your doors, all of these people are going to line up and draw their money out, take their money out. But on the day the bank opens, there's a very famous picture famous in Cedar City, of a line of people outside the bank. And that is the line to deposit, not to withdraw.
Yeah, but I'm sure the bank was worried.
Right, yeah.
Big line coming down.
So they deposit another, $20,000 that day? And it makes the Bank of Southern Utah the only bank in the state that had closed during the Depression that actually reopened. I mean, there were banks like Zion's and others that hadn't closed.
Yeah.
But this was the only bank in this small rural community that saved its bank. They had a big party and, celebrations, but it's an amazing story of again and again of community. Janet Segmiller subtitles her history of the county, Community Above Self. Yeah. So it's an example of that community, again, saying the good of the whole is really more important than myself. Yeah. I really love that story because it perfectly explains something that I've experienced since coming to Cedar City and Iron County. And I think I may have mentioned this on another podcast, but when I got here, I was just floored by the number of people and businesses that reached out to me and said, hey, come join us in this meeting. Hey, come be on this committee. Hey, we're collaborating here. So much collaboration that I was having a hard time keeping track of
what committee was collaborating what. And my experience in a lot of other places that I've been is the opposite. You're usually trying to pull teeth to get people to come together, sit at the table, and let's work together. And that's not to say that other areas or other communities that I've been in haven't been able to work together, but the level of collaboration here in Cedar City and Iron County has just blown me away in order to get things done. And there's a couple of businesses that have come into town, manufacturers, because of that collaboration, because of they see this, and obviously it's, I don't know if environmental, cultural, genetic, whatever, cultural is probably the better word to say, this history of collaborating, putting our means together to bring something here that the locals have foresight enough to say, hey, this is important and this is going to make a big difference here. One of those things, kind of shifting gears a little bit, is, we're known as Festival City USA, kind of coined that term, and some of the history of events in Cedar City is creating a way to attract tourists, creating another way to boost the economy. And another thing that I say about this area is, in Cedar Cities, we have a very diverse portfolio between manufacturing and rail, between tourism, arts and culture, retail. We just have a variety of diverse portfolio that benefits economic development here. Where I was going with that is the Utah Shakespeare Festival. And you don't have to give me, every little detail, but let's talk a little bit about the impact of SUU, Utah Shakespeare Festival, and maybe some of those key players and their foresight and how it has grown to what it is today. And I've said this wrong in a couple other podcasts, I'm going to get it. I was telling you this before. Our Utah Shakespeare Festival is ranked the number 3 Shakespeare Festival in the world.
Yeah, no, I think it's an interesting idea. And what you're talking about are people who really are visionaries in many ways, right? And one of the things that they had going for them that are more challenging for someone like us or yourself is they didn't have the internet. Yeah. They didn't have people, because I know that when you get this job, the first questions people ask are, where's our Costco? Where's our Olive Garden? And where's our Target? Yeah, Target. Right? They're not thinking about rail and other where are these 3 things that I can spend more money? Because that's what they're used to, because they've traveled far and wide. Right. Where these are generally people that we're talking about hadn't been far other than Salt Lake or maybe on an LDS mission and didn't have those experiences, unlike, that change once we get television and the internet and those other kind of things. So I'm not going to, you don't need to answer that question about where our Target, Costco, or Olive Garden is.
So people know we're working on it.
There you go. But so what happens is the university, there is a commitment to education. These people, and it's not just Mormon pioneers, it's people on the frontier in general, want their kids to be educated, right? I mean, communities would hire teachers to come live to teach their kids. So the opportunity that we get to have this school to train teachers is a big deal. And then, of course, it shifts to an agricultural school. And by the time it is not its own university until relatively recently in its history. So the pioneers came, when they first came to Iron County and settled in Parowan, they had 2 books, the Book of Mormon and Robinson Crusoe. And that develops over time. Literally, those 2 books. And as other people bring things in, we talk about Shakespeare. Brigham Young was very committed to drama, right? Not necessarily Shakespeare, but drama itself, plays and recreation was important to him. And this was carried out as a value throughout the Pioneer West. So there is, as you look at the old Iron County record, many, many records or stories of ballets and orchestra concerts and all kinds of things that are happening in this area, or art shows centered around the school, the university, as a cultural hub. What they begin to lean heavily into the 20th century is opera. They're not doing Shakespeare.
Interesting.
Right? I mean, rarely is Shakespeare done. They're spending a lot of money doing operas and classical music concerts, and the Messiah, which is a tradition now, that becomes out of that kind of thing. And these are often combinations between students, teachers, and local community members all working together, right, to put these productions on. So along comes a guy he's a professor at the school. He's the only drama teacher. Generally what he's doing are like Greek plays and that kind of stuff. He decides to get a PhD. So he leaves and they replace him with a tentatively just part-time, you're here until this guy comes back. And the guy's name's Fred Adams, right? He'd been a Delta, raised had gone to school at BYU, loved theater since he was a kid. His parents had inculcated him with the stories of Shakespeare. He knew more about Shakespeare as a young kid. I mean, he didn't know fairy tales like Goldilocks and the Three Bears, but he could talk to you about Midsummer Night's Dream. So he's committed to that. He's also a lover of theater. He wanted to be an actor, but it didn't work out for him. And so he comes to be a teacher of theater, comes to fill this guy's spot. At the same time, the auditorium is built, which is a huge, beautiful, 1950s building, so there's this great theater space involved. So what Fred does is he begins bringing Broadway theater, like musical theater, to here. And he's the first one to bring Fiddler on the Roof to come to this area. He gets the rights to do it. It's a big deal.
About what year did he come here?
He gets here in the 50s. Okay. Right? I don't remember off the top of my head. I'd have to look it up. But in the 50s, or early 60s, but more in the 50s, late 50s. And so he begins thinking about there's not a way to, it's expensive, right? Yeah. Rights are expensive.
Right.
We had done a couple things of Shakespeare, but he says, well, I'll think about doing Shakespeare because I don't have to pay any royalties and we have to do some costuming. So he puts on a Shakespeare, I think it's Romeo and Juliet, hugely popular.
Wow.
Like, I mean, they have to open new nights. And this is from a drama program that oftentimes you would buy a ticket and you'd show up and they'd say, oh, we decided not to do it. Right.
I didn't even think about the fact that not having to pay the royalties would have an impact on what's selected. Yeah.
That's one of the reasons why Shakespeare is so popular.
Yeah.
Right. Is because theaters don't have to pay to do it. So this phenomenal success of Romeo and Juliet is he says there's a community out there that'll make it work. In fact, he was worried when he first did this because he didn't have not a lot of guys in the drama program.
Oh.
So he went to the football coach and said, I need some guys. And the football coach says, who wants to help Fred out? And so the first actors were these football players, right? So this is before the festival. He then has a friend that's pregnant that needs some help up in Ashland, Oregon. He goes there to the Oregon Shakespeare Festival where he befriends Angus Bomer, who's the founder. And Angus Bomer really just takes Fred in. Like, he's a brilliant mentor, talks about the festival, talks about how it's done, lets Fred take notes and all this other kind of stuff. So he comes back. And at the time, Fred is engaged to a woman named Barbara Gaddy. And they're really, again, thinking about how do we stay? Because there's no promise that when this other guy comes back that I'm still going to have a job.
Yeah.
But he's shown that this drama, that there's a love of Shakespeare here.
Right.
But again, we'd only done it 3 times in its whole history before Fred does it.
Wow.
So what he does is the story is there used to be a laundromat on, I think it's First West, called the Fluffy Bundle. There's a historical marker there now. It's a parking lot now. And he and Barbara are put their laundry in and they go out and sit in Fred's car and begin thinking about reasons to stay. Mm-hmm. And they've been thinking about what are the similarities between Ashland and Cedar City. And they're both close to national parks. They're both rural areas. They're both linked to a university. So Fred says, well, if it's going to work there, why won't it work here? And that's the beginnings of what will become known as the Utah Shakespeare Festival. I mean, there's lots of other, ins and outs to how it actually is what it is. But this is where it all starts, is that Fred thinking, we got to do this. Would be a great thing to do. We could bring people here to see these amazing things. He's not just thinking about ways to make Shakespeare look better or the university look better, but how do we get people to come to Cedar City and explore these environments? Because if they come to see the festival, which will
Right.
only be a weekend or two. Then they'll come and they'll stay an extra day to eat and to
Right.
see a national park. And at the same time, think about I-15 coming down, right? He's thinking about ways to bring more people into Cedar City.
Yeah, and that's what's so great here is there is, and I mentioned this earlier, as far as our economy is concerned, we kind of have this diverse portfolio of offerings here, but diversity, and we've talked a little bit about this in our transportation. You mentioned I-15. We've got the rail. We have our regional airport here, which we'll maybe dive into in another podcast, but our 1 in every 10 helicopter.
The second busiest airport in the state.
Yeah, and 1 in every 10 helicopter pilots in the United States is trained right here in Cedar City. And so there's just this great mix. And I think what you were getting at, and I kind of highlighted, was Fred clearly saw a good mix that would be able to make it successful. And so kind of on that note, and to wrap up here, how would you put the impact, the historical and present impact of tourism specifically, and you can even dive into arts and entertainment, but tourism between the Shakespeare Festival, between the parks, how would you put its impact on our local economy and what that means as we move forward?
It's a dicey question because it depends on your perspective.
Sure.
Because there are some in our community who would prefer it to be a rural, agrarian, small town.
And we still have a lot of those
still
elements.
have a lot of those
I mean, we have the Sheep Association that still does
Yep.
right on Main Street, right in that
Yep.
historic downtown. We have this great eclectic mix.
100%.
Yeah.
100%. So you cannot understate the importance of tourism to this economy.
Right.
For good or for ill, right? That meeting in the Cedars Hotel that Gronway Perry overhears, that's the birthplace of modern Cedar City. In my mind, that's the Garden of Eden, right? That's where we start modern Cedar City. Because let's think about the fact that mining as a big organization doesn't exist in Cedar like it did before.
Mm-hmm.
There's not a huge group of people employed at the mines, right? But arts and tourism, those kinds of things are still here, still generating revenue. It's not that those things aren't important,
Right.
but those are continually generating revenue for our community. And at times it gets frustrating because there's a lot of people, but it's important. We cannot underestimate how much money comes in to this community.
Yeah, the tourism
based
tax
upon-
alone.
Yes, huge.
Tourism tax essentially pays for in Cedar City, my events department, event staff, tourism tax 100% pays for everything that they do. Tourism tax pays for what the Office of Tourism does to promote all of the things that we have here. It's self-funded essentially.
Right. And it doesn't just build things for out-of-towners, right?
Right.
It builds things for other people to use as well.
For our locals.
So I think that tourism, some ways, we don't recognize its importance as much as a community, but without it, we would not have modern day Cedar City. Without it, it would be less desirable for people to come stay, to go to school here. And let's not underestimate again how important that is to bring students in who have amazing experiences in our community and environment and then either come back or donate back to the community.
Right.
I mean, how many patrons come back year after year from the festival that had gone to school here that are buying gas,
Yeah.
that are staying in hotel rooms, that are eating food,
Yeah.
that are sharing in that community. It is such a fundamental pillar
Right.
of our local economy.
Well, and people all over the state, that's a great point. You brought up those who've been here and keep coming back. There's people all over the state that buy season tickets to the Shakespeare Festival, right? And they make the trek here from wherever they're up, whether it's up north or south of us. Another element that I thought of with the tourism is, we've got arts and culture, and we've got the national parks. We have the Utah Summer Games and all that it draws in with sports and the facilities that then we're able to accommodate that, and who benefits from that when the Utah Summer Games isn't going on, the locals, right? The local economy. And, there's one thing I always hammer, and I've mentioned this several times since we've been talking today, is diversity in our portfolio. And really, in my mind, that tourism and these things help provide a great diversity to the quality of life that we have Cedar City and Iron County. And really, that's part of the intent of this podcast and Explore Local is let's dive into what do we have here and how come we have such a great quality of life. That doesn't mean to say that there aren't things that could be improved or that we would like to see or that we would not like to see, right? But here we want to dive in and really help people see, gosh, we have a good thing going here, and we just want to keep it going. I don't know if you have any other kind of closing thoughts before we wrap up, but
No, I'm just grateful that you're doing here, and thanks for having me. And I appreciate any time I get to talk about the past of this community as a guide to its future. I think is a really good time.
Yeah, well, and thank you not only for being on the show, but for your personal investment into our community here and preserving some of that knowledge that we have. Because without historians like yourself, we wouldn't really know a lot of these cool stories and these cool facts, and knowing this background of how we got here, and maybe as a guide for where we're going in the future. So, Ryan, thanks so much for your time. Glad to have you.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.